kind introduction, and thank you for having me. Thank you for showing up. Uh, so I actually did my own research on hot skills first, and what you didn't mention was he wrote the Mechanics Manifesto.
I was going to mention it.
And
no one is perfect.
Nobody's perfect. And that this institution was originally Mechanics Institute, as I believe. Mm-hmm. So this had a couple of resonances for me. My father once upon a time wrote an affidavit which described his career, where he said he had once been a mechanic in the Godrej factory. And a mechanic in India merely meant someone who was barely just above a blue-collar worker, taught himself how to operate. And before he was a mechanic, he used to be a coolie in the other station. It's called a Hamal. So mechanics are up there. And there used to be, as some of you know, the idea of educating mechanics who had practical knowledge in some broader ideas. And I have been for the last 10 or 15 years sort of going the other way, which is what can one do to take practical knowledge and put it on a sounder and more respectable intellectual footing. I'll come back to it at the end. Just by way of propaganda, these are 500 pages of what I've written along those lines. I'll weave this into my talk as well. What I come to talk about is this book. And this is a heavy book. If you drop it on your foot, you can go, ouch. And I was trying to figure out what I could do to lighten it up a bit. So first of all, I decided I will not cite anybody. Even I'll cite 4 or 5 people, they're all dead. So nobody should be offended if he or she is not cited. And to make it a tad lively, I will do what everybody's supposed to do at the start of a talk in any case, which is to tell a joke. So
here's the joke.
Here's the joke, exactly. I can't, and the joke is a 17th century joke, and this is from Moliere's The Bourgeois Gentilhomme. And as all of you know, Monsieur Jordan is this up-and-coming bourgeoisie who's tried to elevate his station in life, and so he's hired a philosophy master, and the philosophy master is trying to get him to be more refined, and he says, there's nothing but prose or verse. The philosophy master says, no, sir, everything that is not prose is verse, and everything that is not verse is prose. And Monsieur Jordan says, by my faith, for more than 40 years, I've been speaking prose without knowing anything about it. And I'm much obliged to you for having taught me that. So I have news for you. Regardless of what philosophy masters might say, or even what behavioral economists might say, most of you have been behaving, and most organizations have been behaving reasonably most of the time. And so I don't have any news to tell you, oh, if only you fix this, you'd be king of the heap or whatever. So that may relieve you, or you might feel cheated. Why did we come here in the first place? But there's a somewhat more serious reason for this, which is, why is it that prose has such staying power? Well, for one thing, iambic pentameter would be inconvenient. So it is said that ancient Indian mathematicians had to compose their proofs in poetry, and that was kind of problematic, inefficient, if nothing else. And so it turns out that symbolic representation for math and in many other things is much more efficient. So economists basically use Greek symbols and what Lacan had called an avalanche of numbers, also statistics. And it dominates much of academic discourse, particularly in economics and certainly in the natural sciences. But curiously, the law courts continue to use prose. And Supreme Court arguments in the United States, no doubt over here, do you still have a Supreme Court after these? Or has that been abolished? It's all in natural language, believe it or not. Curiously enough, the language includes figures of speech. It includes similes, it includes metaphors, analogies, and even literary allusions. So there are all these people in black robes, and they're taking liberties with language. in a great many practical domains, this kind of stuff, figurative expression continues to dominate. So the question is, why is that? So evocative expression is prehistoric. So this is from Stone Age caves in France, I think 40 or 60,000 years ago. And it's way down there, and there's there's good reason to believe that this is not just artistic expression, it was a projection of power. Why does this kind of evocative expression continue to be so important? And in a nutshell, my argument is that it reflects the imperative of imaginative discourse. By imaginative discourse, I mean discourse that combines facts and with imagination. And this kind of imaginative discourse is necessary to produce the confidence to cooperate. And it does this by combining, like I said, observed evidence with imagined possibilities. Paradoxically, imprecise given language and figurative similes, using analogies, telling stories, it helps to resolve disagreement about uncertain possibilities. In fact, there's no obvious way around this problem. And the kind of uncertainties I'm talking about are common everyday uncertainties. I have nothing to say about unknown unknowns. I have nothing to say about radical uncertainty. When Mervyn King and John Kay were writing their book, I used to have Zoom calls with them a few times, and I said, why on earth are you calling this radical uncertainty? It's so everyday. They said, well, it's radical by the standards of economics. Well, I said, in that case, I have no argument. So the kind of uncertainty I'm talking about is very simple uncertainty of what Ellsberg had called, he's dead, called ambiguity, produced by known to be missing information. So simple known unknowns. No unknown unknowns and no radical uncertainties. So let me start off by making some archetypal distinctions. So first of all, I'm going to use the ordinary language meaning of uncertainty. And in ordinary language, uncertainty can refer to an internal mental state. I feel doubt, I feel uncertain, or it can refer to an external situation. And so I'm uncertain what the stock market will do this afternoon is uncertain. What Donald Trump will do tomorrow is very uncertain. And these two things are generally linked by known to be missing information. So typically, for most people, the more known to be missing information there is, the less doubt, or the less uncertain we could call that situation. And so they're not terribly different. And I too, I treat uncertainty as the internal condition of doubt, but I don't fuss about it. You could just as easily treat it. You could treat it as synonymous with uncertainties deriving from an external situation, which is the absence of information. What I do want to emphasize, and which I believe does not get emphasized enough or at all in economics, is the distinction between one-off and distributional targets of uncertainty. And by one-offs, I mean specific instances. And by distributional targets, I mean a collection of instances. So whether Giuseppe is more or less honest than Lars is a one-off. Whether Italians are more or less honest than Swedes is a distributional question. Whether it will rain this afternoon before we leave is a one-off. The average rainfall in London and the variance of the average rainfall is a distribution. And you say, why bother with this distinction? Certainly, economics does not, in the main, bother with it. And I argue that there are some profound differences between the kinds of evidence that one uses to resolve or doubts, also uncertainty about one-offs, and the kinds of information that helps reduce doubts or uncertainties about distribution. So I offer you two polar opposite distinctions. And marked are drug trial on the one side, criminal trial on the other. So with the drug trial, you're trying to resolve the distributional uncertainty, which is what is the efficacy rate of this drug when delivered to when administered to a population. And in a criminal trial, we're talking about whether X committed a murder or not. And the kind of evidence that one uses and the kind of evidence that will reduce more or less doubt. In the case of the distribution, is evidence about like instances. So in a phase 1 trial, you basically have 4 or 5 possible patients. Gives you some indication of whether proceeding or not. The pivotal trial is a phase 3 trial where you have it's about a trial you enroll 7,000 patients, and it's the statistics on that the results of that phase 3 trial that give you confidence that the drug is efficacious and whether the side effects are. Whereas the phase 1 trial sort of leaves a great deal more doubt. In the criminal trial, it's not so much the number of observations about the same kind. So if you find 400 fingerprints of the accused in a room, that's not particularly convincing. Finding 4 or 5 because those 2 could have been there by accident. This person was there. In a criminal trial, what you want is more kinds of different sorts, and we're tied to the specific context. So in the distributional uncertainty, we're interested in statistics which abstract away from the specific situation. In the one-off, we are interested in just to like my guilty secret is I'm a fan of Scandi murder series. Anyone seen the series? It's Unit 1. So unrelated to this, the lawyer is a defense lawyer. He gets the accused is acquitted on the grounds that there was not sufficient other evidence besides the confession. And so this I use this for light, but also and the point that we are not looking at one item of evidence. We're looking at a range of items of evidence that creates more or less uncertainty, more or less doubt. So that's on the evidence. I also submit that with one-offs, the kind of reasoning one uses and the kind of reasoning that one finds persuasive is fundamentally different from the kind of reasoning that comes into play when we're talking about distributional uncertainties. Here I will invoke another dead guy, And Jerome Bruner made this contrast between logico-scientific reasoning versus narrative mode reasoning. And he said the kind of criteria for well-formedness of an argument are different from the kind of well-formedness of a logico-scientific. And there are a variety of other reasons that he pointed out. So he sort of took as his archetypal cases, just as I took as archetypal cases, drug trial versus murder trial, he took as his cases math and natural sciences as the extreme form of logico-scientific thinking, and contrasted this with great literature. And he says in the logico-scientific mode deals in general causes with higher and higher reaching for abstraction. And he says ultimately mathematics does not need to deal with anything real whatsoever. In contrast to which the narrative mode, exemplified by literature, deals in human or human-like intention and action, and in the particulars of experience, which it locates in time and place. Both good stories and well-formed logical arguments can be used as a means for convincing another. Yet what they convince of is fundamentally different. Logical arguments convince one of their truths. Stories convince one of their lifelikeness. And he says, yes, scientists also use imagination. Scientists also have flights of fancy. So scientists facts and words, but their work must eventuate in predicting something that is to be right, however much it may speculate. Stories have no such need for testability. Believability in a story is of a different order than the belief in the speculative parts. Now he's making a great literature and math and the natural sciences. I'd submit to you that the same distinction also applies to practical fields. It applies to the law, it applies to business, it applies to entrepreneurship, and yet it is disdained in academia and by statistical modelers. It's just you're generalizing from anecdote. You're telling just so stories. I'll tell you a little story of my own. I will hide the name of the person concerned. But I was 20 years, something on a boat, on a yacht actually, with a very famous economist whose name will remain unmentioned at this point. And we were chatting on the other side of the boat. That's my evil twin. Sorry. On the other side of the boat, there's this woman, and he said, I said, why should you put it? He said, well, I met her in Moscow. She was a very successful journalist. So I thought I'd bring her back to Harvard and put her into the PhD program. And he said, it's not working out. So I said, why is it not working out? She said, well, you know, she's like a journalist. She takes one fact and turns it into a story. And I said, and economists don't do that. He said, Amar, surely you know we need at least two facts. But I think he is wrong. I think it's fundamentally wrong. In the sense, it is not true that the journalist takes one fact. The journalist certainly has one story, has one-off uncertainty which he or she is trying to resolve. But there are a ton of facts associated with that story. Otherwise, the story is not very good or not very persuasive. But this is not what is done in the natural sciences. And the reality is that statistical methods can only resolve one-off and the example that I use in my book is what in American law schools is famous as the blue bus case. And the blue bus, I mean, it's a real case tried in the Massachusetts Massachusetts District Court, then taken to Massachusetts Supreme Court. And the facts of the case roughly are as follows. Someone is driving at night and gets hit by a bus. And it's dark, doesn't see who did it. The facts are fairly well established that the bus was negligent. the bus driver was connected. But it's unclear who the bus was. And it so happens that there is one company called the Blue Bus Company, which operates 70% of the buses in that area. So under a civil trial, this is not a criminal case, the alleged standard is the preponderance of evidence. And the preponderance of evidence is taken to mean roughly more than 50. Well, if percent of the buses in the area run by the Blue Bus Company, of course, there is more than a 50% probability that the bus was a Blue Bus Company. And the judge refused to let it go to trial, said this is ridiculous. The plaintiff appealed, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court affirmed that this was ridiculous. And he said, the Supreme Court said the Paul statistics cannot be used in circumstances of this sort. So if you are dealing with one-offs, statistics might help you a little bit, but they should not be the dominant mode for persuasion in many cases. To the role of imaginative discourse. Which is entrepreneurship. And right, so let's get to entrepreneurship. This is Columbus and Queen Isabella Scott. He had a story. The story turned out to be obviously quite wrong, that he was going to stay to India by going west. But he must have told a heck of a good story. And so Queen Isabella sort of went along. And by the way, any of you have not bought this book, use your research funds to buy it. And there are plenty of pictures in it. And I proceeded in this book. So why is this kind of stuff useful? So much of this book is anchored or starts out nice discussions about uncertainty. And so he's sort of like my guru in this matter. And so here's Frank Knight in 1921 talking about the epistemological problem. And Frank Knight says the existence of a problem of knowledge depends on the future being different from the past, while the possibility of the solution of the problem depends on the future being like the past. And the problems of life, or of conduct at least, arise from the fact that we know so little about the future. The essence of the situation is action according to opinion, of greater or less foundation and value, neither entire ignorance, nor complete and perfect information, but partial knowledge. And one could extend this to say this is not merely knowledge about the future, but knowledge about the unfamiliar in some broad sense. But that here you have it. So if you are going to take any kind of practical decision whatsoever, you have to proceed in ignorance. And not only do you have to proceed in ignorance, you have to proceed according to opinion. You could equally say you have to proceed using your imagination. However, once you are going to act according to opinion, you inevitably will end up in the domain of honest disagreements, because my imagination may work very differently from your imagination. And in some cases, you can go your way and I can go mine. But in cooperative action, where we have to somehow, in many cases, make our imaginations align. Not our facts align. We may have the same facts, but our extrapolation from these facts, our imagination based on these facts, is quite likely to be different. And there, I would submit that groundedly imaginative discourse is what overcomes the impossibility of objective scientific, logical, scientific resolutions about action according to opinion. And then I devote at least a good part of this book talking about how discourse works in the practical domain. So very summarizing heavily. So what are the ends of discourse, of practical discourse in entrepreneurship, and possibly in domains beyond entrepreneurship? First of all, you need to get people's attention and interest. So if you don't have people's attention and interest, your discourse is useless. And in some cases, in a law court, you automatically have attention and interest because you tried. But in business, you have to earn your attention and interest through your discourse. Secondly, you need understanding. essentially your imagination might have come through a flash, and it may be purely tacit knowledge, but that's not good enough. You have to somehow communicate what is in your head and pass it on to someone in somebody else's head. You also, whatever you communicate needs to be in some way plausible. It cannot be proved beyond reasonable doubt in entrepreneurship. It cannot be a deductive solution. It has to be, as Jerome Bruner said, your story has to be a plausible story. And finally, in many cases, if you are trying to align imagination, they're trying to do something cooperatively. You can often derive considerable value from getting feedback from your ideas. So these are roughly the goals and sub-goals of imaginative discourse. And these are particularly true in entrepreneurship, but I'd argue they're probably true. I mean, these are case histories of medical innovations. These are not non-commercial histories. And pretty much the same thing. If you come up with the idea that H. pylori causing ulcers and people don't believe you, you have to go through mechanisms of this sort to win people over. So that's as far as the ends go. What are the means? The means of one, obviously, is the enactment. Steve Jobs being sort of the master of the theatrical presentation. But equally, as I've taught my students over and over again in my courses in entrepreneurship, in selling, often having your story to tell and sort of forcing it down people's throats is frequently far less effective than being able to engage in a conversation and being able to go with the flow with what the other other person says. So enactment plays a big role. Use evocative devices, and use evocative devices because it is very hard to precisely communicate what it is that you are trying to develop or build. So one common evocative device that is used is a metaphor. I'm going to build the Uber of this, or I'm going to build the Airbnb of that. And instantly, without having to tell a long tale about what exactly you're trying to do, there's some communication that has taken place through these devices, and increasingly the use of multimedia becomes more and more important in telling your tale. Curiously, and this is one of these paradoxes which occurred to me while I was writing it, just not in Jerome Bruner's book. Imagined details make your imagined future plausible. There is this famous line from Chekhov where he says, if you're going to hang a pistol on the curtain in the first act, make sure to fire it in the third act. But this is not necessarily true, because if the sets of a stage often have a great deal of things on the stage which are not necessary to the story, but then they create the evocation that what you're doing is lifelike. If you read the New Yorker magazine, they tell you so-and-so was 6 foot 1 inch tall, he wore a plaid shirt and he had deep blue eyes. Well, why do you need to say that if you are merely telling a story about that has nothing to do with the person's blue eyes? It is because things become more real. And in business, one of the most striking examples of this is the spreadsheet. So people present spreadsheets. Everybody knows that 90% of the numbers in the spreadsheet are made up. I mean, people do this in finance as well. It's not. So why do people do this when the constructor of the spreadsheet and the person on the other side both know that it's all assumptions, imagination? And I think that there are a couple of reasons for it. One reason is that it demonstrates that you actually know what you're talking about. So if your spreadsheet says that I'm assuming that there will be 10 salespeople and each salesperson is going to make 100 sales calls, that means you kind of know how many sales calls the person will make. If you say I expect to collect on my bills in 35 days, you kind of know at what rate people pay. There's also quite a subtle aspect of this. The fact that you made up a story, and by the way, I got this from a 22-year-old John Kay's research assistant when I was sharing this with him, which is you are constructing a tale. And everybody knows that what you're going to, the tale that you're telling is probably, your plan is not going to be effectuated because all kinds of things will happen. When bad things happen, you will again have to use your imagination because you cannot deduce the solution. You cannot statistically derive the solution around it. So you're going to do something, you're going to have to do something creative at that point. And the fact that you created this story, a plausible story up front, means you may very well have the imagination and creativity to solve the problem that will undoubtedly arise when you try to implement your plan. And then finally, people use stories and parables to a far lesser degree than the management literature says they use. There's an awful lot of stuff in the Harvard Business Review and various other items of the business press where they say, oh, you have to be a great storyteller if you're going to be an entrepreneur. You don't. I mean, if you take the strict meaning of a story, and we say, well, what is the minimal requirement of a story? That it has to be a reversal of fortune. There has to be an unexpected reversal of fortune. Most of these things do not have any unexpected reversals of fortune. Nonetheless, people use parables and analogies to communicate. So I went, my business school classmate was Clay Christensen. So if you are an economist, you probably have not heard of Clay Christensen. If you're a business school person, you could not have helped hear about Clay Christensen. So Clay was a classmate of mine, and he, for those of you who have not heard of Clay's model is roughly along the following lines. The incumbent dominates the market. The entrant does not have the resources to challenge the incumbent in the core part of the market. So the challenger finds a little peripheral niche to try to get in. In that niche, the challenger's product is not as good as the main product, but it's good enough and it's cheaper. And the incumbent says, this is terrible stuff. We don't want to compromise with what we're doing. And so slowly but surely, the incumbent sort of works his or her way up and builds the line in his or her den. This is a very fine story. It's a very engaging story. It just happens to not conform to about half the startups that I've studied. But I think anybody who've given, I mean, Clay Christensen said the iPhone is bound to fail because it did not conform to a story. Clay Christensen said in 1999 that Microsoft was doomed because it was too expensive and some lower rate version of it would show up. None of this happened to be true. But why is Clay's story, which people, I mean, so the word disruptive has found its way into the English language to an obnoxious degree. You can barely read anything without the word disruptive. And you can thank Clay for having added this word to our everyday vocabulary. And the reason is, I think, if I were to put on Jerome Bruner's hat, is that it's evoking two mythical tales. It's evoking the tale of David and Goliath, and everybody has heard of the David and Goliath story. So resonates with the David and Goliath story. It also resonates with the Greek tragedy, the hubris of the tragic Greek hero, and it works. So anyone who can help it says, "I have a disruptive technology," but whether you do or not, it kind of works. Is this a con job? Is this a con job aimed at gullible targets? This is from an unprompted. I have a few prompted Amazon reviews, but this is from a totally unprompted Amazon review by a venture capitalist. This is what he wrote in the Amazon review of my book. A great talent for an entrepreneur is the ability to imagine a successful outcome and be able to describe that outcome to providers of capital, to prospective employees, and to prospective customers. Each of these audiences must find the story compelling for progress to occur. They will not be lured by false precision. Everybody knows that most young enterprises do not succeed, but people are lured by the quality of the stories, and in that sense participate in the act of imagination themselves. So much for imaginative discourse. My third part of my talk today is the role of routinization. And by routines, I am now invoking Herbert Simon's idea of routines, which again found no traction whatsoever in economics. They gave him the Nobel and then they said, go away, we're not going to pay any attention to routines. And I would submit that much of the discourse, at least commercial discourse, is often embedded in routines. And routines are a little bit like a genre convention in literature. And a genre convention are the specific elements, themes, and characteristics commonly found within a particular genre. They help audiences quickly identify the genre and set expectations for the narrative or style. Over time, these conventions become recognized standards for their genre. And in detective stories, for example, when people buy a detective novel, they expect certain things to be in the detective novel. They buy sci-fi, they expect certain things to be in sci-fi. So these routines in business or commerce play a roughly similar role. They set the expectations and the rules of engagement for the discourses. They sort of specify how much groundedness and how much plausibility is necessary for your discourse to be persuasive. The routines also tend to specify how strict the scrutiny will be of your discourse. They also specify the roles of peers, bosses, and outsiders. Routines tend to be reasonable. They tend to be more or less strict. They tend to have more or less oversight. In part, it depends on the stakes and spillovers. So the routines of a criminal court are different from the routines of a traffic court. In a criminal court, the standards are much stricter. In a traffic court, they can fine you without on cursory evidence. So the higher the stakes, the tougher are the routines, the stricter are the routines. Routines tend to be stricter if you're doing something complex, which requires specialized complex and network. So for example, if you're planning the invasion of Normandy, you're going to have a great deal of planning, as opposed to if you are engaged in a guerrilla war. And it depends on the uniqueness and the extent of one-offness of what it is that you're trying to do. So the more unique the enterprise that you're engaged in, the less strict the routines can be, because, I mean, how strict can you be if you're doing something meaningfully novel? These generalizations, I think, apply outside commerce, but in commerce, I would suggest that routines tend to have this kind of congruence. I don't know if any of you have read, the economists included, the lesser known of the Farmer and Jensen papers and circa 82 or 83. Well, Farmer is still alive, so I've violated my rule. Jensen is quite good and dead. And so basically, scarfing from those three papers, I suggest that routines are reasonable to the degree that there's a three-way congruence between the routines on the one side, the uncertainty, complexity, and the resources required on the other, and where you raise the money from on the other side. And this congruence leads reasonable routines of different kinds of organizations to fall along the spectrum, which is that at the northwestern corner, where you have self or informally financed entrepreneurs, there's very little evidence necessary, but there's no capital. On the bottom right-hand side of my distribution are public companies where there's a great deal of scrutiny, but at the same time, the uncertainty, or at least in terms of missing information, is much less. And the sort of the intuition behind this is that the public company is relying on the capital of arm's length stockholders who have no access to what your governance procedures are. And so in some sense, they are betting on the fact that you have good management process in place and that they are trusting the good management process. And also the large companies tend to, so that the capital gives them the wherewithal to undertake mega projects. The mega projects also tend to be more complex. So these complicated routines also help you coordinate the many moving parts that a large organization has. Let me point to two things over here. Large public company routines have lower tolerance for uncertainty than the self-financed entrepreneur, sure enough. But it is not zero. Large company routines are not the Bavarian bureaucracy that proceeds strictly according to rules. If you strictly said no uncertainty will be allowed, the game would not proceed. I mean, these businesses would have to close down shop. So large companies do make mistakes. They do undertake uncertainty. There is some role for. The second part is that there's a blank space in the upper right-hand corner. And here where we may have an argument about this. I think the idea of a high uncertainty, high capital investment enterprise is bunk. It does not exist, or it almost certainly does not exist. That I'm a great fan of Nate Rosenberg's incremental innovation. I think Schumpeter was full of nonsense when he his rhetoric of it is just rubbish. And this is true not just of commerce. This is true of medical innovations as well. Medical innovation. I mean, the only thing I can find in here where there could be something in the upper right-hand corner would have been the CT. Everything else proceeds initially with very little capital. It's two doctors in Perth who figure out with virtually no capital that H. pylori are the cause of cancers. You can even go to CARTs, which is sort of the most cutting edge over here. That too takes decades to go along. And the decades are basically through a progression of trial and error, starting small and scaling up. I simply do not believe, I have not seen, and I've been studying this field from the bottom up for the last 40 years. I have not seen great leaps forward. Sorry, you can take a different point of view on this. I would also say that there's frequently a progression of, so these routines are more or less stable, because otherwise, if there's no stability, there's no routine. Nonetheless, they're reasonably dynamic in the sense that as the organization evolves, its routines change as well. And indeed, if the routines do not change, the organization cannot evolve. So I use this as an example of Amazon. So Amazon starts off in 1994, basically with Bezos's money and money from Bezos's father and a few friends. Then Bezos, by the following year, raises money from angel investors. The angel investors help launch the first store. Eventually, you get VCs that they fund the initial growth, and then you get public stockholders around about 2000. And many companies do not go beyond the initial stage. They start there. And things are not as telescoped in time as they were in the case of Amazon, but there's roughly this progression going down this way. So let me end with some concluding comments. So first of all, I would like to point out to you that there's an ancient scholarly prejudice against studying one-offs. I mean, I have scars on my back for having tried to write over and over again studies which were based on studies of one-offs. And desk rejects were complete. I mean, the reason I wrote so many books is that I could not get my stuff published. in scholarly journals. My only scholarly journal article was in the Journal of Financial Economics. And the only reason, I have other sort of quote unquote referee articles, but nothing of heft. And the only reason it is there is because Michael Jensen was broad-minded enough to see that the narrative mode discourse that I was presenting had value. And there was a brief shining moment for 4 or 5 years where Jensen was able to fill the JFE with articles like mine. But this is an ancient prejudice. It goes back to Aristotle. So this is not something particularly new. And I'm now quoting from Forrester, the philosopher of sciences article, where he says, for Aristotle, there can only be knowledge of the universal and necessary. What is individual and what is contingent cannot be the object of knowledge. Action is based on practical wisdom, must also recognize the particulars, for it is practical and practice is concerned with the particulars. That is why some who do not know, and especially those who have experience, are more practical than those who know. Practical wisdom engages with the individual, but can only do so in blindness. There can be no science of the individual. John Stuart Mill challenged this on a variety of grounds, and this has been the frustration of my life, and this is what I'm trying to do with this as well, is trying to say, what is it that studying from individual case, from doing 2 coronary bypasses, how does one proceed from there? And the knowledge of the practical, of the contingent, and of the specific deserves at least as much attention as the study of statistics. And even this practical wisdom of Aristotle's blind practitioner has been disdained by modern evidence. There's this mantra which is chanted incessantly, which is follow the science, follow the evidence. This is nonsense. Evidence does not speak. Evidence has to be interpreted, because what happened yesterday is not guaranteed to happen tomorrow. Go read your Hume. And there's a dysfunctional disregard for contextual differences. So Mervyn King has very kindly quoted an aphorism from my book in one of his recent pieces on inflation target. And the argument there is that if you stick to a model which was derived from the past, you are going to go wrong, because the economy is a dynamic, evolving entity. And therefore, you have to use your imagination to imagine how the economy has evolved, to tweak your model to figure out how to apply it. And therefore, as I say in my book, imagination, evidence is a complement to imagination. It is not a substitute for imagination. If you do simply bet on historical patterns, you are like Russell's inductivist Turkey. If you know the story, Russell's inductivist Turkey.
That's some guess.
Sorry. So Russell's inductivist Turkey, the turkey gets fed like clockwork at 9 o'clock in the morning. The turkey then derives this rule that I get fed every morning at 9 o'clock. And this rule works perfectly until Christmas. And the turkey is slaughtered, of course. And this is not about unknown unknowns. These are banal uncertainties, because we live in a world of relentless enterprise, which makes uncertainty ubiquitous and mundane. The past is necessarily an imperfect guide, even if history isn't a bunk. Forget this machine learning magic. We must imagine machines cannot foretell. Since he's waving at me.
2 minutes.
Okay, so I think you can read this on your own.
Oh, wait, not 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, so just to remind you of some of the salient features of imaginative discourse. Imaginative discourse bridges observable evidence, what has happened, and imagined futures. It requires metaphorical, or often uses metaphorical evocations. It assumes imagined details and paths, and the evidence complements, doesn't replace imagination, and the content and process of this discourse is shaped by organizational routines, and these routines, if they're reasonable, are shaped by stakes, novelty, and complexity. It's stable but not static, and it sustains a diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem. Since none of you are practitioners, I will not, but here's what I have by way of practical advice, such as it is. I'm not a business guru. I don't do well in giving practical advice, but here are some. It's pretty self-evident. Take routine seriously. I can never pronounce his name. Leonhufvud, the Swedish macroeconomist.
Oh, Leonhufvud.
Leonhufvud. So he wrote a very nice. I won't ask you to read. He wrote this very nice tribute to Herbert Simon, and he said that what he came around to, and the hard way, was that what is decided is frequently determined by how it is decided. And he said, one day, some decades from now, other economists would find this as well. And so you need to have routines. They can't be too light, they can't be too loose, they need to be stable and predictable, they can't be fossilized. Beware of the capricious go for broke visionary. And then finally, the last piece of advice is to myself: just never miss a good chance to shut up. And so I will shut up.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have 15 to 20 minutes for discussion and then questions afterwards.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. And thank you for your very insightful and thought-provoking talk. Definitely had various reactions as I was listening. I think I will focus my comments in three areas. One, I want to say a little bit, because you've covered such a lot of ground. You've talked about uncertainty, you've talked about discourse, you've talked about routine. So I think I want to share something that resonated with me related to discourse. And then I want to spend some time talking about a type of innovation which I feel is not incremental innovation, and then some of the issues that arise around that. And I'm curious to also to share with you and also hear your thoughts on how routine can be relevant. And if there's time, I'll talk about one more thing, which is about how to increase adoption of some of these innovations which are not really incremental. And I'll define what I mean by not incremental. I love incremental innovation, I have to share though, and I'll come back to that. But just first of all, thinking of discourse. So the things that you said reminded me of, interestingly, something I had read on the weekend, which was a note that John Steinbeck wrote about writing. And if you think about it, speaking is a form of discourse, but writing is also a form of discourse. And I'm going to read this out. So what he said is, the discipline of the written word punishes both stupidity and dishonesty. A writer lives in awe of words, for they can be cruel or kind, and they can change their meaning right in front of you. They pick up flavors and odors like butter in a refrigerator. So I think that kind of shows the power of writing and discourse, which you were talking about. And if I may, I want to just share a longer second paragraph that he wrote, where he says, a writer out of loneliness is trying to communicate like a distant star sending signals. He isn't telling or teaching or ordering. Rather, he seeks to establish a relationship of meaning, of feeling, of observing. And then he goes on to say, we are lonesome animals. We spend all our life trying to be less lonesome. And one of our ancient methods is to tell a story, begging the listener to say and to feel, yes, that's the way it is, or at least I feel that way about it, and you're not alone. And so this is an interesting, this is not necessarily about entrepreneurship, but merely about articulating a story. I'm curious what you think about the connection between this and the kind of discourse that you've been talking about.
You want me to reply now? Or?
You could
Oh, no,
later is
oh,
fine as
oh,
well. Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
invest to let you finish and I'll take up on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And so now I want to move to the thing that I was saying about why I like incremental innovation. I teach operations management, which is really about the management of processes, whether they are production processes or service processes. And a lot of one company that we always teach about is Toyota, because Toyota came up with this Toyota production system. And the idea in the Toyota production system was really about incremental innovation. Every single worker on the assembly line could literally stop the line if they saw a problem, and then people on the line would solve the problem. So these were usually small problems, small changes. And I'm a big fan of that. But at the same time, I think there are some kinds of innovations which are, even though they are production or delivery related, in that they're not like a new drug or a new kind of medical science, but they are still not incremental. So I'll share one example which I came up with, came to see. I didn't come up with it. I saw this happening in the US maybe 17 or 18 years ago, when I used to be a professor at the University of Virginia. And in the medical school, there was a medical doctor, a preventive care cardiologist. So you wouldn't go to her if you were having a heart attack, but if you had some of the risks. And she had come across this idea of a shared medical appointment. Have any of you come across this notion? So the idea is that if you needed to go to a preventive care cardiologist, you wouldn't be going one-on-one. Instead, there would be 5 or 10 other people who have the same issues. So they have also come for cardiac preventive care. So you're meeting your doctor, but with 5 or 10 other patients. And then the doctor doesn't give you a lecture. The doctor will literally go, Amar, what was your issue? Why have you come in? And then diagnose. And then to each of you, what was your issue? Why have you come in? Diagnose. So it's like a one-on-one, but it is not private. It's a sort of a one-on-one where other people can listen in. And so and the interesting thing that I had seen is that in that UVA medical school, this was not a randomized control trial or anything like that, but this doctor decided to do shared appointments in her clinic. And what she found is that productivity improved massively, like went up 3 times, because a lot of what she was saying to the patients was the same thing about how to manage your diet, how to exercise, etc. And then there was a little bit of specific information about particular drugs and so on. But much more interesting than that was the fact that, in fact, one of the key metrics that you'd look at for preventive cardiac care is weight. And weight in her clinic was much lower than in other clinics in the same health system, which were not doing these shared appointments. So to me, that feels like I'd call that a non-incremental and more like a big step innovation if you do this kind of thing, because there's a potentially big improvement in outcomes, in their case, revenues also, and a potentially big reduction in cost. Or it could be one or the other or both, better outcomes and lower cost. And so when I saw this, I thought, wow, this is very interesting. And it would be nice to study this in a scientific fashion. Because it's quite possible that only the kinds of patients who are very happy to. How many of you would go to a shared appointment? You'd be willing to go when there's other people? So many people say that no way. I mean, I don't want to, my doctor relationship is sacrosanct. And it's possible that maybe some of you, people like you, self-selected into that doctor's clinic. So I thought this would be nice to study more scientifically, where one could actually randomize people into a shared or a group appointment versus not. But I spent about 6 years and I couldn't convince any hospital. I mean, they told me you're out of your mind. There is someone called Lord Darzi here in the UK who wrote the Darzi review recently. So I had looked up when we moved to England. I figured out that this guy is important in the NHS. He'd been the former parliamentary undersecretary to health.
Guy.
Very.
So anyway, I went to his office and I, talked to him for an hour and asked him a very nice wood office and all of that. So I said, would you consider shared appointments for the NHS? And he looked at me and he said, Kamalini, I'm a colorectal surgeon. I see zero use for shared appointments, which was interesting. He did say that, well, maybe it has some use pre-surgery and post-surgery, but I had basically gone to all kinds of hospitals. And then finally I thought, why don't I visit this eye hospital in India, which I'd heard is very innovative because they had re-engineered cataract surgery and did it extremely quickly. And so now this is where I'm getting to the routine part of innovation. So I managed to connected with a very senior person in the hospital. And he said in an email exchange, he said, yeah, definitely you can come, but you're coming from the West. So you have to tell us something new. Quite interesting, right? So then I thought, what can I tell them about? I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a business school professor. But at any rate, I went there and I told them about shared appointments. And they then said, we can use that, not to do cataract surgery, but for glaucoma, which is a lifetime disease. And people don't come for their appointments. And the only way you can push back glaucoma is by coming for your appointments every 3 months, taking the meds, because the meds change. And they had this hunch that maybe shared appointments work for glaucoma because patients may somehow help each other, support and all of that. And I, of course, got very excited thinking, wow, randomized. Their routine was asking any random visitor to share something new. But then the other part is they said, no, we're not going to do any randomized control trial. We are not even going to use any doctor for this. We are going to take a counselor. So they had a counselor who would talk to patients after the doctor met them to explain what did the doctor mean, how do I take my eye drops, which reduced the amount of time that the doctor spends. By the way, this is the biggest eye hospital in the world. So they do 2/3 of the eye care volume of the NHS at 1/100th of the cost by re-engineering cataract surgery, by making a doctor's job, a small part is doctor and the rest is counselor or other nurses, etc. And so they first had a counselor do a shared appointment with a few patients, and they realized that, gosh, patients are learning from each other. One patient asks a question, another patient asks. But then after that, they did various pilots. So this is another routine that you're taking on something that looks rather different. Right? It's not your usual with a small type of doctor appointment, but trying it out in many different ways. So they did all these pilots on a Sunday. Every 2 months they were doing a pilot on a Sunday. The first time they asked me how many patients, I said 5 or 10. They invited 25 patients. Can you imagine 25 people? And in the end of that one, because I happened to be there, I asked the doctor, what did you think of it? And she was very annoyed. And she said, it felt like a wedding. Indian wedding is a complete, chaos, everybody walking around. But they had another routine in place. They had asked every patient for feedback. So then they took all that feedback and they reduced the group size to 8. And then finally, 2 years of doing all this, did we actually run a randomized control trial? So what I was thinking is that another thing that one can do to deal with innovation, and I also think with entrepreneurship, there's entrepreneur, but there's being entrepreneurial. So I think this massive eye hospital, which is not a for-profit enterprise, it's a not-for-profit, they're highly entrepreneurial because they are taking ideas that are just dropping in from anywhere, and then they are testing them out. And if they think it will work and it has legs, then they will test it bigger. So that was the second thing I wanted to share with you, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. You spent some time thinking about this. Sort of like we are all blind men and the elephant. We see it in our own way. So what is incremental and what is discontinuous often lies in the eye of the beholder. Somehow the idea of that appointment does not strike into discontinuous innovation. And certainly the process that you described by which it actually got implemented was incremental. So, I mean, things are more or less discontinuous than others, but in my observation, 99.9% of things are incremental in some way, shape, or form. Or they're not there's a great deal of incrementalism that ends up before something changes, before the needle is moved. On the first point, was quite interesting. So I've been recent. So there's a journal called The Critical Review that's doing a special issue of my book, and they had Charlie Calomiris. I don't know how many of you know him. He's sort of like a financial economist from Columbia, right? One of the, and I was kind of surprised, and basically he said, well, here are 20 phrases in his book which you would not find in an economics journal, and like imagination, like reasonableness, like etc. And then he said, well, let me add something to this. He said, Amar's point about imagination is right, but imagination must be disciplined by recognition. Well, that's interesting. And then I started thinking about it and said, what do I really mean by imagination, and what does Charlie really mean by recognition? And then I tied myself up into knots. Could not really specifically define what I really meant by imagination, other than the process that produces the result that I think it produces. And likewise, recognition is a very fuzzy word as well. So that gave me a great deal of discomfort, which is, am I just sort of blathering on? And in the process, I ended up reading Wittgenstein's stuff. And as some of you know, the two Wittgensteins, the first Wittgenstein from Tractatus, where he says language. And if statements which are absolutely not true or false do not belong. And then the second Wittgenstein basically says language is how you use it, and it's extremely contextual. It is it gets meaning from its use. The uses are multifarious, and live with it. And that's what I thought your quote from Steinbeck says. There's also a further angle to this, and I'm now quoting Jerome Bruner and his analysis of narrative discourse. And what Bruner says in his analysis of novels is that the job of the novelist is to take the familiar and make it seem unfamiliar. And you take something which seems completely mundane, like Hedda Gabler and sort of the routine, boring life, and find something unusual in it. And I thought about it for a bit, and I think the entrepreneur's job is exactly the opposite, which is to take something novel, practical novel, is disturbing. The entrepreneur's discourse is soothing. And so I think the degree to which you can go into finding commonalities across discourse, across applications, is kind of limited. So it has to be, to some degree, contingent. What it is. So these are my two responses here.
Okay, so first question.
When you say the lack of large investments with large uncertainty, you just mean business. You're not including things like D-Day landing, which you.
Marriage.
So I mean, at the back of my mind has been a bunch of non-business examples.
Okay.
But I hesitate to offer too many generalizations across. But having said that, I would say that the D-Day landing very much falls into the kind of the planning routine for D-Day is rather like the kind of project planning that goes into the launch of the next generation of Windows, which is it's a cast of thousands. There are lots of moving parts. The stakes are enormous. The room for sort of a complete redo is limited, as opposed to a special operations where you have 5 people, where the routine leaves a great deal open. So yes, in this particular case, I see some similarities between the kind of planning one observes in large companies, and even so, both large companies and I mean, I don't think Putin had this particular outcome in mind when he invaded. I don't think Napoleon really expected to lose half of the army going.
If I could have a second one.
Yes, of course.
The transition from the first Wittgenstein to the second Wittgenstein, Frank Ramsey played a big role in that.
In the first Wittgenstein.
But in persuading in the transition to the second Wittgenstein.
Okay, you're much more familiar with the second with Wittgenstein than I am, but
But my point was the way that he did it, and also the way he persuaded Keynes, was telling stories.
so
Because he also persuaded Keynes as well.
So first of all, it is open to serious debate, and I've read a bunch of stuff.
Who is responsible?
No. I've read substantial debate about whether he actually persuaded Keynes or not. And you're probably familiar with this.
Yeah.
People like O'Donnell, etc., say he absolutely did not persuade Keynes. Keynes said kind words because Ramsey died prematurely, and he is not about to attack his protege in France.
But Keynes never pursued that particular view of probability.
I think because he was trying to do something which was impossible. I mean, it was a blind alley. I think his idea of trying to broaden the idea of probability to include non-quantifiable probabilities, which are most, was exactly spot on. I think Ramsey was dead wrong. This is my idiosyncratic. As also King, by the way. But on the persuasion of Wittgenstein, I just find the timeline difficult because Wittgenstein returns to Cambridge in 1929. Ramsey's dead the following year.
But they had been in contact during that.
Well,
the point is that it's the stories, and Keynes, again, his argument is a narrative argument most of the time of telling
Absolutely.
particular stories.
And one of the things I've in this critical review report which I'm writing is economics once accommodated the narrative of discourse. So the Wealth of Nations, the general theory, even Marshall's principles had a great deal of narrative discourse. That's basically been flushed out now. And if you flush it out, you lose a lot. And so I'm not saying that one should get rid of the logical scientific discourse in economics, far from it, but at least some letting that stuff back in would not be such a terrible.
People like Akerlof and Schiller are actually arguing for the importance of that.
So in this particular article, I take issue with Schiller's view of narrative economics as well. And Schiller takes a rather negative view of narrative. I mean, his metaphors are interesting. It's disease. It's narrative which basically destabilizes markets. His mode of reasoning is very statistical. It's basically back of words, and the notion of taking narrative in a positive sense and looking for its positive aspects. So Schiller is basically trying to address distributional uncertainties. What happens in the market as a whole? I think narrative plays at least as important a role in micro, in small numbers discourse between a few entrepreneurs and a few investors. And I think Bob's not going to like what I said, but Bob is just going up, so hopefully.
Anyone else?
And he has the Nobel Prize.
It's the case quite often, isn't it, behind a very formal explanation.
Sorry?
It's often the case that behind a very formal explanation actually is a narrative which is not explicit in it. I think a lot of economics does have a narrative, but it's not actually explicit.
And what is her name? Deirdre McCloskey claims that
Yeah.
a great deal of rhetoric underneath the surface.
Yeah.
But it's not. Perhaps there's some value to be more upfront about it.
As long as you're aware of it, it's okay.
I suppose the counter argument is, not devaluing the concept of narrative, just how incredibly dangerous narrative is. In a way that science in principle shouldn't be dangerous, but narrative as evidence, they're all narrative. And look how dangerous narrative is in isolation. And science and the scientific approach, is a counterweight. Sure, I quite agree. Scientific approach that you can help along by narrative. You can tell a story, and actually economists do that all the time. Lemons, Lucas tree models, island economies. We tell lots and lots of stories that help us along. But we back them up with something that we ideally think has some sort of structure to it, and then we try and see if there's some data against it. But I think your point about the medical trials is interesting because, I think I interpret what you said as being that the double-blind trial is all very well, but you have to spend quite a long time working towards it, because otherwise you're doing a double-blind trial on a really stupid idea or a very crudely set up idea, and so you try stuff out. And of course, they're the one-off thing. And of course, many things in practical life are one-off experiences. I just changed the way I do my midterm test after 10 years, and I think I was probably doing it wrong for 10 years, but I don't know because I can't run a double-blind test.
Also courts, courts, if they paid a little bit more attention to distributional evidence, they would do better.
Yeah.
The Lucy Letby case, where she is jailed possibly wrongly because they paid very attention to distributional evidence.
But fundamentally, that case was because they paid any attention to distributional evidence at all.
No, because it's narrative, it's emotional and narrative driven, and it's just you've gone completely wrong.
But the reason for her conviction in the first place was that the argument was that this is probabilistically impossible.
Yeah, bad science is also dangerous.
Yes,
Possibly not as bad as because bad science can at least be refuted by other science,
Yes.
whereas you can't refute narrative with other narrative. They're just competing narratives.
So, John, Mervyn, answer this man and tell him how dangerous good models is.
I think the inferences you can make from science. So, for instance, a lot of really good scientists were eugenicists, and they support the whole range of things like that. But on the case, going back to the argument, the range of evidence, there's a lot of dispute about DNA being used, and the prosecutor would say there's only one chance in the 30 million that this match didn't happen. The fact he happened to be 300 miles away was discounted, and so that the scientific evidence was right. There was only 1 in 300 million chance, but that was irrelevant to this particular one-off decision.
So 1 in 300 million chance again is based on a sample, and no one in the financial crisis was based on historic evidence. The past is different from the future, as Knight said. And
And that particular one was Goldman Sachs being silly, using a normal distribution just over the previous 10 years, which has been very quiet. So
That is because of narratives, right?
Yeah.
The financial crisis is because of bad narratives. Because people believe that everything, because things are working well, there's a general narrative that things will keep working well.
that's his story, and he's sticking to it.
Yes. That is the main thing that happened. That people believe that house prices will keep rising. Therefore, why not lend to people who can never repay? So therefore, it's not a crime if I can just give a homeless man some mortgage.
So
Because house prices.
One of the papers that I could not get published.
But-
Sorry.
But I mean, following up from, you were talking about Robert Schiller. I mean, for example, compare Robert Schiller's approach to this. I'm not a complete fan of Schiller, but compare him with, for example, Galbraith discussing the Great Crash, which is a fantastic story, but tells you absolutely nothing of any use. It's just because there's not a single number in it. You never find out how much the stock market fell by, or whether it was, by any metric overvalued. Schiller, in talking about house prices, said, why don't we construct a long time series of house prices? Oh, look, it appears to have no obvious trend in it. Therefore, probably that the American house price is seriously overvalued. I mean, it was crude stuff, but it was an attempt at some kind of science to back up his narrative.
I didn't need Schiller to tell me that our prices fallen.
but wait,
The older John Hicks, when he mellowed as you got older, he often seemed to be saying, if it's a good, convincing theory, you should be wary of any evidence to seem to disprove it. Never let a good theory be spoiled by bad evidence. And he actually seemed to have some idea that the narrative was actually of itself a problem. Maybe that's dangerous.
It's not so much the evidence, it's what you do with the evidence and joint hypothesis problem.
So this is not being recorded. I'll tell you Bob Schiller's story about high house prices and my personal, but maybe over tea. I'll tell you.
so in Stiglitz's latest book, The Road to Freedom,